Good evening, dear friends. Make yourself comfortable, though I should warn you, comfort may not last. Tonight's tale is not about a knife. It is not about a rope or a revolver or any of the instruments that Inspector Slack would recognize. Tonight's tale is about a sentence. A single sentence, spoken over a garden fence on a Tuesday morning, passed from mouth to mouth through St. Mary Mead like a stone dropped into still water, except that water settles. This did not. Mrs. Partridge is dead. The police have called it suicide. The village has called it inevitable. Miss Marple has called it neither, because Miss Marple, as you may have gathered by now, does not call things until she is quite certain what they are. I should tell you now, Detective, this is not a comfortable story. It does not begin with a body in the library or a scream in the night. It begins with a whisper. And a whisper in a village like St. Mary Mead is far more dangerous than a scream. Stay sharp tonight. The weapon is not hidden in a drawer. It is hidden in plain sight, in the space between one neighbor's mouth and another neighbor's ear. Shall we begin? Mrs. Marion Partridge was found on Thursday morning by her daily help, a Mrs. Finch, who arrived at 8:20 to discover that the back door was unlocked, the kettle was cold, and her employer was sitting in the armchair by the window, in a position that Mrs. Finch would later describe to Inspector Slack as not right. She was not wrong. Mrs. Partridge was dead. The house was orderly. The curtains had been drawn the previous evening and not reopened. A cup of tea, untouched, filmed over, sat on the small table beside the armchair. Next to it, an empty bottle of barbitone tablets, prescribed by Dr. Haydock 8 months earlier for persistent sleeplessness. The label read, 1 at bedtime. The bottle had contained, at its last refill, 24 tablets. It was empty. B for attendance, chi. Inspector Slack arrived at 9:30, surveyed the scene with the efficiency of a man who has seen too many scenes and enjoyed none of them, and delivered his verdict before the kettle had been reboiled. Open and shut, he said to Constable Briggs, who was taking notes with the concentration of a man afraid of spelling errors. Suicide, sleeping pills, sad business, but there it is. He was not interested in the cup of tea. He was not interested in the fact that the tea had a faintly herbal smell, sharper than Mrs. Partridge's usual Darjeeling. He was not interested in the cushion on the chair, which had been placed carefully, precisely, behind Mrs. Partridge's lower back, as though someone had wanted her to be comfortable. Inspector Slack was interested in closing his file and returning to Much Benham before lunch. The village, however, was not interested in closing anything. The village was just getting started. By 10 o'clock, Mrs. Finch had told Mrs. Glover at the post office. By 15:15, Mrs. Glover had told Miss Hartnell, who happened to be buying stamps. By 11, the news had reached Mrs. Turner at the general shop, where it collided with the morning bread delivery and spread outward with remarkable speed. Mrs. Partridge was dead. Sleeping pills, suicide, and everyone knew why. Because the thing about Mrs. Partridge's death was that it was not, to the village, a surprise. It was a conclusion, a full stop at the end of a sentence that had been writing itself for 9 days, ever since the rumor had started. That rumor, that quiet, devastating, unstoppable rumor that had moved through St. Mary Mead like damp through old walls, invisible until the plaster cracked. Nobody would say later that they had believed it entirely. Nobody would admit to having passed it on with any enthusiasm. And yet it had reached every house, every garden, every pew in the church by the following Sunday. And Mrs. Partridge had known it. She had known it because people stopped calling, because Mrs. Glover at the post office looked away when she came in, because Roger, her own son, had not visited since Tuesday. The funeral was held on Monday. It rained, not heavily, but with the thin, persistent drizzle that makes English funerals feel like a national tradition rather than a personal loss. The church of St. Mary Mead was full, which was unusual for a weekday, and which told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about the village's relationship with guilt. They had come to bury Mrs. Partridge. They had also come to look at each other. Vicar Clement, who suffered from a constitutional inability to say anything unkind, delivered a eulogy that touched upon Mrs. Partridge's devotion to the flower committee, her excellent scones, and her 32 years of quiet, blameless life in the village. He did not mention the rumor. He did not need to. It sat in every pew like an uninvited guest. Miss Marple, seated 3 rows from the back in her usual position, close enough to observe, far enough to be overlooked, watched the congregation with the attention that other women her age reserved for knitting patterns. She watched Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in black crepe that appeared to have been purchased rather recently, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she never actually touched to her face. Mrs. Price Ridley had the expression of a woman who had done her duty, though what that duty was, she would have been hard-pressed to define. She watched Miss Hartnell, who sat very straight and looked at no one, which was unlike her because Miss Hartnell usually looked at everyone and found them wanting. She watched Janet Callender, seated in the front row beside Roger, her hand on his arm, the picture of quiet, selfless support. Janet's hat was modest, Janet's gloves were pressed, Janet's grief was, to all appearances, genuine. And she watched Roger Partridge, 41 years old, broad-shouldered, red-eyed, who stared at his mother's coffin with the expression of a man who had arrived too late for something he could not name. After the service, tea was served in the parish hall. Mrs. Bantry, who had organized the refreshments with her usual directness and total absence of tact, was overheard saying to Colonel Bantry, "Well, it's very sad, of course, but one can't help wondering whether it might have been avoided if people had simply kept their mouths shut." The colonel, who had learned over 4 decades of marriage that agreement was the only safe harbor, said, "Quite." The whispers resumed before the sandwiches ran out. "Such a tragedy," said Mrs. Glover to Mrs. Turner, passing the sugar. "Well," said Mrs. Turner, who did not deal in euphemism, "she had her reasons, if what they say is true." "I never said it was true," said Mrs. Glover quickly. "You didn't have to," said Mrs. Turner. "You said it to Miss Hartnell, and Miss Hartnell said it to Mrs. Price Ridley, and after that, well, after that it might as well have been printed in the parish newsletter." Miss Marple, standing near the urn with a cup she had no intention of drinking, heard this exchange with perfect clarity. She also heard, from the opposite side of the hall, a younger woman's voice, clipped, London-inflected, saying to Roger Partridge, "There's no point in torturing yourself. What's done is done." That was Diana. But Diana would come later. For now, Miss Marple was listening to the thing that no one was saying aloud, not the rumor itself that had been said quite enough. She was listening to the silence around it, the silence of people who knew they had been part of something and were already deciding that they had not. She set down her cup. She had heard enough. What was the rumor? It was, in its final form, the form that had reached Mrs. Partridge herself. Very simple. Marion Partridge's son Roger was not her husband's child. That was all. 1 sentence, 13 words. In another era, in another place, it might have been absorbed, disputed, forgotten. But this was St. Mary Mead in the spring of 1954. And in St. Mary Mead, a woman's reputation was not a private matter. It was public property, maintained by consensus and demolished by committee. The rumor held that Marion Partridge, some 25 years earlier, had conducted an affair, the details varied depending on who was telling it, and that Roger, born in 1913, was the result. The late Mr. Partridge, a decent and unremarkable man who had died of pneumonia in 1949, had either known and forgiven or not known at all. In either case, the rumor continued, the marriage had been built on a lie, and the lie had been kept for 1/4 of a century. And now it was out. The effect on Mrs. Partridge had been immediate and total. She was not a woman built for scandal. She was 63, small, precise in her habits, devoted to her garden and her parish duties, and possessed of a quietness that some mistook for dullness, and others, Miss Marple among them, recognized as dignity. She had no talent for confrontation, no gift for denial, no instinct for the sharp retort that might have stopped the whisper in its tracks. She simply retreated. She canceled her seat on the flower committee. She stopped attending church. She stopped going to the shop. Janet Callender brought her groceries. She stopped answering the telephone. And then she stopped breathing. "Suicide," said Inspector Slack. "Sleeping pills, clear as day." But Miss Marple, walking home from the funeral in the drizzle, her umbrella slightly tilted against the wind, was not thinking about sleeping pills. She was thinking about a cushion. She had visited Mrs. Partridge 4 days before the death, a brief call to bring a jar of quince jelly and, more importantly, to observe. Mrs. Partridge had been pale, thin-lipped, and unwilling to meet her eye. The cushion on the armchair had been in its usual position, square to the back, slightly left of center, where Marion always placed it because of her hip. When Mrs. Finch found the body, the cushion was behind the lower back, centered, adjusted, a small thing, meaningless perhaps, but Miss Marple had known Marion Partridge for 30 years, and Marion Partridge placed that cushion in the same position every evening with the mechanical precision of a woman for whom small habits were the architecture of life. She would not have moved it, not if she were sitting down to die. Someone else had moved it, someone who had placed it there with care, the care of a person making another person comfortable, the care of someone who was present. People who intend to die, Miss Marple reflected, do not tidy. They do not adjust cushions. They do not pour tea they will never drink. They sink into the chair, and they let go. She had seen it once before, old Mrs. Ackroyd, in 1937, who had left everything exactly as it was, including a half-eaten biscuit on the plate. That was what surrender looked like. This was not surrender. This was arrangement. "I think," said Miss Marple, to nobody in particular, buttoning her coat against the rain, "that I should like to know who spoke first." She did not mean who spoke first at the funeral. She meant who spoke the sentence that started everything, the original mouth, the first link in the chain. She knew where to begin. Everyone knew where to begin. Mrs. Price Ridley lived at the end of the High Street, in a house slightly too large for one person and considerably too small for her opinions. She had been a fixture of street. Mary Mead for 40 years, treasurer of the Women's Institute, organizer of the Harvest Festival, and the most efficient distribution network for private information that the village had ever known. She did not gossip, she would tell you. She observed. She drew conclusions. She shared those conclusions as a public service. Miss Marple called on her the following morning at 11, the hour at which Mrs. Price Ridley was most receptive to visitors, having finished her correspondence and not yet begun her lunch preparations. "Miss Marple, how kind. Do sit down. I was just saying to— well, never mind. Tea? Thank you. No sugar." Mrs. Price Ridley poured with the ceremony of a woman who believed that the act of pouring tea conferred a certain authority upon the pourer. She settled into her chair, arranged her face into an expression of profound sympathy, and said, "A dreadful business about poor Marion." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Dreadful. I blame myself, of course." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose by approximately 1 millimeter, her version of astonishment. "Do you?" "Well, not myself, precisely. But one feels, as a member of the community, one feels that something ought to have been done. Someone ought to have, I don't know, spoken to her, reached out." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Someone did speak. That, I think, was rather the problem." Mrs. Price Ridley's teacup paused in mid-air for the briefest of moments. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "The rumor," said Miss Marple, "about Roger. I never started it." "No, but you heard it. One hears things. One can't help hearing things. This is a village, Miss Marple, not a monastery." "Quite so. And from whom did you hear it?" Mrs. Price Ridley set down her cup with the expression of a woman being asked to reveal state secrets, which, in the economy of St. Mary Mead, was not far from the truth. "I don't see that it matters now. The poor woman is dead." "It matters," said Miss Marple, "precisely because she is dead." There was a silence. Mrs. Price Ridley examined her biscuit as though it contained hidden meaning. "Miss Hartnell," she said at last. "It was Miss Hartnell who mentioned it. Over the telephone. Last Wednesday week. She rang about the flower committee rota, and then she said, Almost in passing, you understand, almost as an afterthought. She said that she had heard something rather extraordinary about the Partridge boy. And what did you do with this information? I did nothing with it. I may have mentioned it to one or two people. In confidence, strict confidence. How many people? Mrs. Price Ridley's chin lifted. I don't keep count, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled. It was not, if one were being precise, a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 70-odd years watching human nature operate at parish level and had long since stopped being surprised by it. It reminds me, she said, reaching for her teacup, of Mrs. Weatherby's parrot. You remember Mrs. Weatherby? She lived at the end of the lane before the war. She had a parrot that repeated things quite accurately, but always in the wrong tone of voice. Everything it said sounded like an accusation. Mrs. Weatherby could never understand why visitors left so quickly. Mrs. Price Ridley stared. I am not, she said, a parrot. No, indeed. A parrot has the excuse of not understanding what it says. You have no such excuse. The visit ended shortly after. Miss Marple walked home with a name, Miss Hartnell, and a question that was considerably larger than the answer she had received. Mrs. Price Ridley had passed the rumor, but she had not created it. She was the amplifier, not the source. The loudest speaker in the room, yes. But someone had switched her on. The trail, as Miss Marple had expected, did not end there. Miss Hartnell lived in a cottage on the lane behind the church, a small, determined woman of 68 who had spent her life in a state of righteous vigilance, monitoring the moral health of St. Mary Mead with the dedication of a customs officer inspecting luggage. She suspected everyone of something. She was, on occasion, correct. Miss Marple found her in the garden, attacking a rosebush with secateurs and the expression of a woman settling a personal score. Miss Marple, what a surprise. I was just thinking about poor Marion. Sit down. No, not that chair. It wobbles. There. Miss Marple sat. Miss Hartnell continued pruning with the energy of suppressed emotion. I suppose, said Miss Hartnell, not looking up, you've come about the rumor. I have come, said Miss Marple, about the truth. Whether those are the same thing remains to be seen. Miss Hartnell set down the secateurs. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat in the non-wobbling chair with the air of a woman preparing to give evidence. I told Mrs. Price Ridley. I admit that. I told her because I thought she ought to know, as a senior member of the parish. I did not tell her to go spreading it all over the village like manure on a flower bed. And what exactly did you tell her? What I was told. That Roger Partridge was not, that he was not Arthur Partridge's natural son, that Marion had, well, that there had been an entanglement, years ago, before the war. An entanglement, said Miss Marple. With whom? Miss Hartnell hesitated. I was told it was a farmer from outside the village, a man who used to deliver eggs. Miss Marple considered this. Mrs. Price Ridley's version involved an officer. An officer? Miss Hartnell's voice rose by a full octave. I said nothing about an officer. It was a farmer. I was quite clear about that. A man with eggs. And who told you about the man with eggs? Mrs. Turner, at the shop. It must have been last Tuesday week. I was buying thread, and she said, quite casually, as though she were discussing the weather, she said she had heard something remarkable about the Partridge family. Remarkable, said Miss Marple. Her word, not mine. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The farmer had become an officer somewhere between Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley. The eggs had vanished entirely. The entanglement had sharpened from remarkable to scandalous. Each mouth had added its own pigment to the portrait, a little resentment here, a little imagination there, until the original sketch was unrecognizable. This was how it worked. Not a telephone game that implied accident. This was chemistry. Each person who touched the rumor changed its composition, and every change made it more volatile. Thank you, said Miss Marple, rising. You have been most helpful. I only said what I was told, said Miss Hartnell, reaching for her secateurs. I can't be held responsible for what other people did with it. No, said Miss Marple. That is what they all say. She walked down the lane toward the shop. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky remained the color of old dishwater, neither threatening nor clearing, simply persisting, as English weather does when it has nothing particular to accomplish. Mrs. Turner remembered the sentence. She did not remember the face. The general shop on the high street was the true nerve center of St. Mary Mead, not the church, not the post office, not Mrs. Price Ridley's sitting room. It was in Mrs. Turner's shop that information was exchanged at its most concentrated, because every person in the village came through those doors at least twice a week, and Mrs. Turner, stationed behind her counter with her bread knife and her opinions, heard everything and forgot nothing. Almost nothing. "Miss Marple, sliced or unsliced?" "Neither, thank you." "I've come to ask you something." Mrs. Turner put down the knife and leaned on the counter. She was a practical woman, 55, wiry, with the economy of movement that comes from spending 30 years in a space too small for unnecessary gestures. She did not waste words any more than she wasted bread. "About Marion Partridge?" "Yes." "I thought you might. You're the fourth person to come in here asking about that rumor, and I'll tell you what I told the other three. I didn't start it. But you passed it on. I mentioned it to Miss Hartnell, once, in passing." "What did you say exactly?" Mrs. Turner considered. She reached for a tin of biscuits, moved it 2 inches to the left, not for any practical reason, but because she thought better with her hands occupied, and said, "Someone came in. I don't remember who. It was a busy morning. The bread delivery had just arrived, and the Henderson's boy was underfoot as usual. Someone came in and said, or rather implied, that Roger Partridge might not be Arthur's boy, that Marion had taken him from somewhere. That he wasn't born to her." Miss Marple was very still. "Taken him," she repeated. "That's what was said. Not an affair, mind you, not how it ended up by the time Mrs. Price Ridley got hold of it. What I heard was that the child had come from somewhere else, that Marion had passed him off as her own." "And you don't remember who said this?" Mrs. Turner shook her head. "It was between 8:30 and 9. The shop was full. Could have been anyone who comes in at that hour, Mrs. Glover. Old Mr. Partridge's nephew from Brackhampton, the woman who cleans at the vicarage." "I don't recall." "I'm sorry. I remember the words because they struck me. I don't remember the mouth." Miss Marple thanked her and bought a small jar of damson jam, because it would have been odd to leave without buying anything, and oddness in Miss Marple's profession was a luxury she could not afford. She walked out into the high street with 2 things she had not had before. The first was a jar of jam. The second was a discrepancy. The rumor, as it had reached the village, was about an affair, a woman's shame, a man, farmer or officer, depending on the source. But the original sentence, as Mrs. Turner remembered it, had been different. Not an affair. A child taken from somewhere. A child passed off as her own. That was not the same story. It was not even the same kind of story. And the difference mattered, because one version was about Marion Partridge's morality, and the other was about Marion Partridge's kindness. Someone, between Mrs. Turner's counter and Miss Hartnell's telephone, had rewritten the sentence, changed its meaning, sharpened it from an oddity into a weapon. Or, and this was the possibility that Miss Marple turned over in her mind as she walked, someone had spoken the original sentence knowing that the village would do the sharpening for them. She was still thinking about this when the London train arrived at 2:30. Diana Partridge née Mercer stepped onto the platform at Brackhampton with the composure of a woman who had packed the appropriate outfit. She wore a charcoal coat, a small black hat, and gloves that had been chosen to convey grief without inviting conversation. She carried 1 suitcase. She did not look as though she intended to stay long. Roger met her on the platform. He was unshaven, which was unlike him, and his jacket was buttoned incorrectly, which was unlike anyone. "You look terrible," Diana said, and kissed his cheek in a way that was technically a kiss, but functionally a full stop. "Mum's dead." "I know. That's why I'm here." She picked up her own suitcase before he could reach for it. "Have you spoken to Mr. Carstairs?" "Who?" "The solicitor. About the will." Roger stared at her. "She's been dead 4 days. And the will doesn't become less relevant because we're sad about it. Is there a taxi or do we walk?" They walked. Roger carried the suitcase. He had taken it from her at the second attempt, with the stubbornness of a man who had been raised to carry women's suitcases regardless of the women's views on the matter, and they walked in a silence that was not companionable. Miss Marple, who happened to be sitting on the bench outside the post office with a clear line of sight to the station road, observed their arrival with interest. She noted the suitcase, small, one outfit, 2 days at most. She noted Diana's stride, purposeful, not wandering. She noted that Diana did not ask what had happened, did not ask how Roger was feeling, did not ask any of the questions a woman might ask when arriving for a death. Diana already knew the answers. This did not, in itself, mean anything sinister. Roger would have telephoned. He would have told her. There was nothing unusual about a wife arriving informed. But there was something in the angle of Diana's chin, slightly raised, slightly forward, that suggested not grief, but calculation. She was not arriving at a tragedy. She was arriving at a situation. And situations, in Diana's vocabulary, were things to be managed. Miss Marple made no judgment. She had been wrong about chins before. But she filed it away, in the same cabinet where she kept Mrs. Turner's discrepancy and the cushion in Mrs. Partridge's armchair. Roger Partridge had not spoken to his mother in 3 days. Later, much later, he would describe those 3 days as the worst of his life, worse even than the day he was told she was dead, because at least death was final and silence was a choice, and he had chosen it, and that was the thing he could not forgive. He had heard the rumor on Tuesday evening in the bar of the Blue Boar. Not from a gossip, from Tommy Landon, who drank mild and bitter and meant no harm, and who said with the clumsy gentleness of a man out of his depth, "Look here, old chap, I don't know if you've heard, but people are saying things about your mother. About you, actually." Roger's first reaction was fury. His second was to walk out. His third, the one that arrived at 2 a.m, when he was sitting in the kitchen of the house he shared with Diana, staring at a cold cup of tea, was doubt. Because the thing about a rumor is that it does not need to be believed. It only needs to be considered. The moment you think, what if, even for a second, even with contempt, the damage is done. The seed is in the ground. You cannot unthink the question. Roger had thought it. Sitting there at 2 a.m, he had thought, what if I am not my father's son? And then, what if my mother has lied to me for 41 years? He did not go to her the next day. Or the day after. He told himself he needed time to think, that he would go on Friday, that he would sit down with her and ask, calmly, like an adult, whether there was any truth in it. Friday was too late. "I should have gone," he said to Miss Marple, standing in the garden of his mother's empty house 2 days after the funeral. His voice cracked on the word gone and did not recover. "I should have. I knew she was alone. I knew what people were. And I didn't—" He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. "I didn't go to her." Miss Marple stood beside him. She did not touch his arm, because she understood that some people are held together by the absence of comfort, and that a kind hand, at the wrong moment, can be the thing that breaks them. "No," she said. "You didn't." It was not a kindness, but it was honest. And Roger, who had spent 3 days being told by everyone that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, that Marion wouldn't have wanted him to blame himself, Roger heard the honesty and nearly smiled, because it was the first true thing anyone had said. "She didn't do it," he said. "Did she?" Miss Marple looked at the garden. The daffodils were out. Mrs. Partridge had planted them in October, pressing each bulb into the cold earth with the optimism of a woman who expected to see spring. "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't think she did." There was, however, one person who had not abandoned Marion Partridge. Janet Callender had been Marion's closest friend for nearly 30 years, since the Callenders had moved to St. Mary Mead in 1925 and taken the cottage with the blue gate on Vicarage Lane. Mr. Callender had died young, a heart attack in 1938, very sudden, very sad, and Janet had remained, alone, in the cottage with the blue gate and the garden that was the envy of the flower committee. She was a quiet woman, not quiet in the way of Mrs. Partridge, who was quiet because she had nothing loud to say, but quiet in the way of someone who had decided, long ago, that listening was more useful than speaking. She attended every village event, sat on 3 committees, and was universally regarded as kind, a word that, in St. Mary Mead, was used so rarely and so precisely that it amounted to a decoration. When the rumor broke, Janet was the only person who went to Marion. "Poor Marion," she said to Mrs. Bantry, wrapping a loaf of bread in grease-proof paper with the brisk tenderness of a nurse preparing a dressing. "She has no one. Roger won't come. I go every day now, take her tea, sit with her, make sure she eats something. She doesn't eat, you know, not properly." "You're a saint," said Mrs. Bantry, who used the word freely and with no theological implications. "Nonsense, she's my friend. One does what one can." Janet visited every afternoon. She brought groceries from Mrs. Turner, carried them up the lane in a basket, and she brought tea. Not ordinary tea. A herbal blend she made from her own garden, chamomile, lavender, something she called lemon balm, and a few other things she grew in the south-facing bed near the wall. She had been making it for years, swore by it for sleep, for nerves, for the general business of getting through an English winter without going mad. "My own recipe," she told Mrs. Bantry. "Marion loves it. She says it's the only thing that calms her down. I make a fresh pot every time I go. None of that reheated nonsense. Fresh leaves, hot water, 10 minutes to steep. She always has 2 cups, sometimes 3. Miss Marple, who happened to be pruning a shrub near Mrs. Bantry's garden wall at the time of this conversation, heard every word. She heard my own garden. She heard fresh leaves. She heard 2 cups, sometimes 3. And she thought of the cup on the table beside Mrs. Partridge's armchair, the one with the herbal smell, filmed over, untouched, or rather, not untouched, unfinished. Miss Marple continued pruning. She did not look up. She did not ask a question. But something, a small, cold thing, no larger than a seed, lodged itself in the back of her mind, where it would remain undisturbed until it was ready to grow. "Good evening again, Detective. I hope you're keeping track because Miss Marple certainly is. Before we continue, if you're enjoying tonight's mystery, do stay. Subscribe to our little channel, leave a comment if you've spotted something, and tell me, who do you think started the rumor? I have my suspicions. Miss Marple has hers, and I suspect they are not the same. Stay sharp." The story is about to change direction. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table with a sheet of paper, a pencil, and a cup of tea that was, emphatically, Darjeeling. She did not trust herbal blends. She had never trusted herbal blends. Flowers belonged in gardens, not in teapots. On the paper she drew a diagram. Not a diagram in the formal sense. Miss Marple had no training in formal things, but a series of names connected by lines, arrows, and the occasional question mark. At the bottom she wrote, "Mrs. Partridge, dead." Above that, Roger, told Tuesday Pub Tommy Landon. To the left, Mrs. Price Ridley, told everyone, her word, version, officer, affair. Above Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Hartnell, told her Wednesday week version, farmer, eggs, entanglement. Above Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Turner, told her Tuesday week version, child taken from somewhere, not born to Marion. Above Mrs. Turner, the question mark was the largest thing on the page. 6 mouths, 6 versions. The rumor had passed through Mrs. Turner, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Price Ridley, and then outward to Mrs. Glover, to Tommy Landon at the pub, to the woman who cleaned at the vicarage, to the bread delivery man, to anyone and everyone who had 2 ears and insufficient restraint. But it had started before Mrs. Turner. Someone had walked into the shop on a busy morning, between 8:30 and 9, bread delivery underfoot, the Henderson boy crawling about, and said something. Something specific. Something that did not sound like gossip because it did not use the language of gossip. Not, "I heard" or "they say," but a statement, a fact. A sentence that landed on Mrs. Turner's counter alongside the change for a loaf. And Mrs. Turner did not remember who. Miss Marple looked at the question mark. She tapped it twice with the pencil. She knew several things about this person. First, they knew the truth, or a version close enough to be dangerous. Not the affair that had been added later by other mouths. The original sentence was about a child taken from somewhere else. That was specific. That was not village imagination. That was knowledge. Second, they had chosen Mrs. Turner's shop as the delivery point, not the post office where Mrs. Glover would have demanded details, not Mrs. Price Ridley's sitting room, where the interrogation would have been immediate and thorough. The shop, because the shop was noisy, crowded, distracted. A sentence could be dropped and left, like a parcel without a return address. Third, they had come between 8:30 and 9, not the quiet hour, the busy hour, the hour when faces blend together and voices overlap, and a single remark, however extraordinary, could be lost in the clatter of the till and the sound of bread being sliced. This was not carelessness. This was design. Someone had placed the Rumour in the village's bloodstream with the precision of a doctor administering an injection into the vein most likely to carry it fastest, at the moment least likely to be observed. Miss Marple set down her pencil. She looked at the diagram. She looked at the question mark. Interesting, she said. The diagram told her who had carried the Rumour. It did not tell her who had created it. And those, Miss Marple reflected, were two very different questions, as different as the wind and the person who opens the window. The question mark had a name. Miss Marple did not know it yet, but she knew where to look. She began, as she often did, with the person who noticed everything and understood nothing. Colonel Bantry was in his garden at Gossington Hall, engaged in a dispute with a blackbird that had, for the third consecutive year, eaten every one of his early strawberries. He was losing the dispute, as he had lost the previous two, and was therefore in the foul temper that made him most useful as a source of information, because Colonel Bantry, when irritated, forgot to be discreet. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Blasted bird. Can't shoot it, Dolly would have my head. Sit down, won't you?" "No, don't mind the mud." Miss Marple sat on the bench, which was damp but structurally sound, and allowed the Colonel to finish his assessment of the blackbird situation before steering the conversation toward less feathered matters. "I wonder," she said, "whether you happened to see Diana Partridge in the village, before the death, I mean, 10 days or so ago." The Colonel frowned. "Diana? Roger's wife? The London one?" He said London, the way some people said suspicious. "As a matter of fact, yes. Saw her coming out of Mrs. Turner's shop. Tuesday week must have been, because I was on my way to the post office for stamps, and I only go on Tuesdays." "Was she alone?" "She was. Had one of those smart handbags. Looked like she was in a hurry." "Did you speak to her?" "Said good morning." She said good morning back. Brisk about it, but she's always brisk, that girl. London manners. He waved a hand dismissively, as though London manners were a known species of garden pest. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple, which was a lie, and which the Colonel would have recognized as a lie if he had not at that moment been distracted by the reappearance of the blackbird. Diana had been in the village on Tuesday week, the same Tuesday that the Rumour reached Mrs. Turner's shop. She had been in Mrs. Turner's shop, or coming out of it, at approximately the right time. Miss Marple walked home slowly. Diana Partridge née Mercer, London, sharp, practical, a woman who asked about solicitors on the 4th day of mourning, a woman who carried a small suitcase because she did not intend to stay. The motive arranged itself with unpleasant clarity. Mrs. Partridge's late husband, Arthur, had left a will. The will was straightforward, everything to Marion for her lifetime, and then to Roger. The house, the savings, the small portfolio of investments that Arthur had accumulated over 40 years of careful, unremarkable work in insurance. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough for Roger and Diana to buy a house, enough for Diana to stop working at the publishing firm in Bloomsbury, where she spent her days editing manuscripts she considered beneath her. But the will depended on Roger being Arthur's son. If Roger was not Arthur's son, if the Rumour was true, then Roger's claim to the estate was, at best, questionable, at worst, void. A challenge could be mounted. The money could be redirected. Diana was clever enough to know this. She had a degree from the University of London and an appetite for legal detail that Roger, who had inherited his father's talent for straightforward living, did not share. Had Diana walked into Mrs. Turner's shop on a busy Tuesday morning and dropped a sentence on the counter like a coin? It was plausible. More than plausible. It was elegant. She would have known that Mrs. Turner was the fastest distribution point. She would have known that the village would do the rest. She would not have needed to say much, just enough. A fragment of truth. Roger was not born to Marion, delivered without context, without accusation, in the neutral tone of someone making a factual observation. The village would supply the accusation. The village always did. And then Diana could step back, wait for the rumor to do its work, wait for Mrs. Partridge to crack, to confess, to deny, to produce evidence one way or another, and then use whatever emerged to challenge the will. Diana had not wanted Marion dead. Diana had wanted Marion cornered. Miss Marple considered this theory as she walked up the lane. It held together. It had motive, opportunity, method. It had the particular cruelty of using a community as a weapon without dirtying one's own hands. It was, she reflected, exactly the sort of plan a clever person would make. The trouble with clever plans, in Miss Marple's experience, was that they tended to attract other plans, the way a lamp attracts moths. You light a fire for one purpose, and someone else warms their hands at it for another. She was still thinking about moths when she remembered something that had been bothering her since the funeral. It was 25 years old. Miss Marple had a memory that functioned less like a filing cabinet and more like a garden. Things planted decades ago would surface unexpectedly, pushed up by some subterranean pressure she could neither predict nor control. She did not trust her memory to be complete. She trusted it to be significant. She remembered the spring of 1931. She remembered it because of the snowdrops. They had come early that year, February, not March, and she had been in her garden cutting the first stems for a vase when she saw Marion Partridge walking up the lane with a pram. Marion had been married to Arthur for 3 years. There had been no children. The village had noticed this with the attentive sympathy that was, in practice, indistinguishable from judgment. And then, in March, quite suddenly, there was a baby. A boy, Mrs. Price Ridley had announced at the Women's Institute meeting with the satisfaction of a woman delivering a headline. Born last month. They're calling him Roger. The village had been pleased, not surprised. They had assumed it was simply a matter of time, but pleased. Children anchored a family. Children made a house a home. Children meant that the Partridges would stay, and the cottage would not fall into the hands of outsiders. Miss Marple had been pleased, too. But she had also been observant. She had seen the baby. She had seen him in the pram outside the post office 3 days after the announcement. He was a healthy child, with a full head of dark hair and the robust, indignant expression of an infant who had firm views about being left outdoors. He was not a newborn. Miss Marple had raised no children of her own, but she had seen enough babies, christened enough, visited enough, observed enough over garden walls and in parish halls to know the difference between a child of 2 weeks and a child of 4 months. The hands were wrong. The neck was wrong. The way he held his head, steady, focused, tracking movement, was the work of months, not days. Roger Partridge, in March 1931, was at least 4 months old, which meant he had been born no later than November 1930. Marion Partridge had not been pregnant in November 1930. Miss Marple had seen her at the Harvest Festival in October, slim, brisk, carrying a tray of preserves with the ease of a woman whose body was entirely her own. She had not mentioned this to anyone. It was not her business, or rather, it was not yet her business, because no crime had been committed, and curiosity without purpose was merely gossip. But she had remembered. And now, 25 years later, in the sitting room of her cottage, with a diagram on the table and a dead woman in the churchyard, the memory surfaced like a bulb pushing through frozen earth. Marion's sister, Eleanor, had died in January 1931. Pneumonia. She had been living in Bournemouth, unmarried, working as a secretary at a small law firm, and not, as far as anyone knew, involved with anyone. The death had been sudden and sad, and, in the way of deaths that happen far from home, quickly absorbed into the ongoing business of the village. 2 months later, Marion had a baby. Miss Marple sat very still. She looked at the diagram. She looked at the question mark. And she saw, with the quiet, cold clarity that was her particular gift and her particular burden, what had happened. Marion Partridge had not had an affair. Marion Partridge had taken her dead sister's child and raised him as her own. The baby was Eleanor's. Born out of wedlock, a catastrophe in 1930, a shame that could not be spoken, a secret that would have destroyed Eleanor's memory and Roger's future in a single breath. Marion had done the only thing she could. She had taken the child, moved the pram into her hallway, and lied. She had lied to the village, to the parish, to Mrs. Price Ridley and the Women's Institute, and the bread delivery man, and everyone who had ever counted the months on their fingers and found that they added up. She had lied for 25 years. And the lie had been an act of love. The rumor, the sentence spoken over the garden fence, had been, in its original form, close to the truth. Roger was not born to Marion. He was taken from somewhere. But the rumor, as it passed through the village, had been translated from a secret kept out of love into a scandal born of shame, from protection into adultery, from sacrifice into sin. And that translation had killed her. Not because the rumor was true, because the rumor was true enough, close enough that Marion could not deny it without revealing the real secret, and could not reveal the real secret without destroying her sister's memory and her son's identity. She had been trapped, not by a lie, by the truth. Miss Marple folded the diagram and placed it in the drawer. She had found the secret. She had not yet found the killer. Because the secret explained why Marion Partridge had retreated, why she had stopped eating, why she had sat in her armchair and stared at the curtains and let the village's whispers close around her like water. It did not explain the sleeping pills, 24 barbiton tablets, prescribed by doctor. Headache for persistent sleeplessness, 3 refills over 8 months, carefully dispensed, carefully rationed. Marion had been a cautious woman with medication, as she was cautious with everything. She took 1 tablet, 1, every night. She kept the bottle on her bedside table, next to her reading glasses and the small brass clock that Arthur had given her for their 10th anniversary. Inspector Slack's report, which Miss Marple had not officially seen, but which Constable Briggs had left on the table at the police station while making tea, and which Miss Marple's eyesight, despite her years, remained perfectly adequate to read at a distance of 4 feet, stated that Mrs. Partridge had ingested approximately 20 tablets, 4 times the lethal dose. Consistent with intentional overdose, the report concluded. No signs of forced entry, struggle, or third-party involvement. No signs. Miss Marple thought about signs. A woman who takes 1 tablet every night for 8 months does not, one evening, take 20. Not because she lacks the despair, Marion had despair enough, but because she lacks the knowledge. How did Marion know that 20 was fatal? She was not a medical woman. She was not a reader of crime fiction. She did not know, could not have known, the precise arithmetic of self-destruction. Someone had counted those tablets. Someone who knew the dosage, knew the bottle, knew exactly how many would be enough, and someone had moved the cushion. Miss Marple put on her hat. She was going to visit Janet Callender. The cottage with the blue gate had a garden that made other gardens feel inadequate. Not through size, it was modest, no more than 40 feet deep, but through density. Every inch was planted, tended, cultivated with the obsessive precision of a woman for whom growing things was not a hobby but a vocation. Roses along the fence, lavender by the path. Herbs in the south-facing bed, chamomile, lemon balm, thyme, mint, and several things Miss Marple could not immediately identify, but which she suspected were not entirely decorative. And in the far corner, near the compost heap, a tall stand of foxglove, digitalis purpurea, beautiful, architectural, and in sufficient quantity, lethal. Every part of the plant contained cardiac glycosides. Every gardener knew this. Every gardener also knew that foxglove was common, unremarkable, and grew in half the cottage gardens in England. Its presence proved nothing. Its presence was, in the language of the law, circumstantial. But Miss Marple was not a lawyer. She was a gardener. And she noticed that Janet's foxglove was not in the border with the other flowers. It was in the corner, near the herbs, near the chamomile and the lemon balm, near the plants from which Janet made her special tea. Miss Marple, What a lovely surprise. Come in, I've just put the kettle on. How kind, said Miss Marple. I came to thank you. Thank me? For looking after Marion. During those last days. You were the only one who went to her. Janet's face softened into the particular expression of modesty that people adopt when they know they are being praised and believe they deserve it. It was nothing. She was my friend. I couldn't leave her alone with all that talk. No, quite right. The talk was very cruel. Cruel, said Janet with sudden force. People have no idea what words can do. Mrs. Price Ridley should be ashamed of herself. All of them should. She poured tea, Darjeeling, Miss Marple noted, not the herbal blend, and they sat in Janet's small, immaculate sitting room, where every surface was clean and every cushion was plumb, and the temperature was maintained at a level that suggested Janet Callender believed firmly in the healing properties of warmth. I was wondering, said Miss Marple, accepting a biscuit she did not want, about Marion's tablets, the sleeping pills, the barbitone. Yes, she'd been taking them for months. Dr. Haydock prescribed them after Arthur died. She couldn't sleep. Did she keep them by her bed? Always, on the bedside table, next to her clock. And during your visits in that last week, were they still there? Janet hesitated. It was a small hesitation, the kind that most people would not notice, and that Miss Marple noticed the way a seismograph notices a tremor 3 counties away. Actually, said Janet, I brought them downstairs. She was spending all her time in the armchair. She wouldn't go up to bed. I thought it was safer to keep them where she could reach them. I put them on the shelf in the sitting room. You moved them. I was trying to help. She needed to sleep. Even in the chair, she needed something. I measured out her dose every evening before I left. 1 tablet in a glass of water, and left the bottle on the shelf. On the shelf, said Miss Marple, not the bedside table. No, on the shelf. I was keeping them safe for her. Miss Marple looked at the shelf in Janet's sitting room. There, between a brass candlestick and a framed photograph of the late Mr. Callender, stood a small brown glass bottle. The label read, Barbitone, Mrs. M. Partridge, 1 at bedtime. You still have them, said Miss Marple. Janet looked at the bottle as though seeing it for the first time. Yes, I must have. I brought them back here after it happened. I wasn't thinking clearly. I meant to give them to Inspector Slack. But you didn't. No. Miss Marple set down her teacup. She did not reach for the bottle. She did not need to. She had seen it. She had seen its position, not hidden, not displayed, but placed with the unconscious care of someone who was accustomed to having it on a shelf. Your garden is beautiful, she said, changing the subject with the practiced ease of a woman who knew that changing the subject was, itself, a form of investigation. The foxglove in the corner, is that a new planting? The foxglove? No, it's been there years. It self-seeds, you know. I can't get rid of it. I've always thought foxglove rather dangerous. It is, if you eat it, but one doesn't eat one's garden, Miss Marple. Janet laughed. It was a short, bright laugh, perfectly calibrated. No, said Miss Marple. One doesn't. She walked home through the lane. The late afternoon light was gold through the hedgerow, and somewhere in a garden a blackbird was singing, a different blackbird from the Colonel's nemesis, or possibly the same one, celebrating its strawberry victories. Miss Marple was not listening to the blackbird. She was thinking about patterns. Janet Callender had visited Marion Partridge every day for a week. She had brought tea, herbal tea, from her own garden, from the bed where the foxglove grew beside the chamomile. She had moved the sleeping pills from the bedroom to the sitting room. She had measured out the dose every evening. She had access, daily access, to the bottle, the pills, the tea, the woman, and the armchair. She had moved the cushion. Miss Marple was almost certain of that now. Janet had placed the cushion behind Marion's lower back, centered, adjusted, the way a nurse adjusts a pillow, because Janet had been there when Marion fell asleep for the last time, and Janet had wanted her to be comfortable. The kindness of it was the worst part. It reminded her, and this was the thought that arrived with the blackbird's song and stayed, of old Mr. Hodgson's nurse. That had been in 1928, or perhaps 1929. Mr. Hodgson, who lived in the house on the hill beyond the church, had been ill for 2 years, declining, fading, becoming less and less of himself with each month. His nurse, a Mrs. Brierly, had been the kindest woman in the village. Everyone said so. She brought flowers. She read to him. She adjusted his pillows and measured his medicine and sat with him through the long afternoons. She had poisoned 3 patients with their own medication before anyone thought to ask why they all died so peacefully. Kindness, Miss Marple reflected, was the perfect alibi. Because nobody investigates kindness. Nobody questions the woman who brings tea, who carries groceries, who sits by the bed and holds the hand. Kindness is invisible, and invisibility, for a murderer, is worth more than any amount of cunning. Miss Marple had reached her front gate. She stood with her hand on the latch and looked at the lane where Marion Partridge had walked every day for 30 years, where Janet Callender had carried baskets of groceries and pots of herbal tea, where the sentence had been spoken and passed and transformed and delivered like a letter bomb to a woman who had done nothing more terrible than love her sister's child. 2 crimes, she thought. Not 1. 2. The first crime was the rumor. Someone had placed it in the village knowing what it would do, knowing that St. Mary Mead would amplify it, distort it, weaponize it. Diana had done this. Miss Marple was nearly certain now, Diana, who had been in Mrs. Turner's shop on Tuesday week, who had motive to expose the secret, who had the cold intelligence to use a community as a tool. Diana had wanted leverage. Diana had wanted money. Diana had not wanted death. The second crime was quieter, smaller, almost gentle. Someone had watched Marion Partridge break, watched her stop eating, stop sleeping, stop answering the door, and had seen not a friend in crisis but an opportunity. A woman already dying of shame would not be investigated. A woman already full of sleeping pills would not be autopsied. The rumor was the smoke. The tea was the fire. One crime was loud. The other was silent. And the silent one was murder. Miss Marple did not telephone Inspector Slack. She did not telephone anyone. She put on her second-best hat, the one she wore for visits that were not social, and walked to Gossington Hall, where she found Colonel Bantry in the study, reading the Racing Post with the concentration of a man avoiding his wife. "Colonel," she said, "I need you to remember something for me." "Anything, Miss Marple. Sit down. Whiskey?" "No, thank you. I need you to remember Janet Callender." The colonel lowered his newspaper. "Janet? Nice woman. Quiet. Good garden." "Yes?" "I wonder, did she ever say anything to you about Marion Partridge? Anything that struck you as unusual?" the colonel thought. He was not a fast thinker, but he was a thorough one, and Miss Marple had learned that patience, applied to Colonel Bantry, produced results that haste did not. "There was one thing," he said slowly. "Years ago, don't remember when, might have been at the flower show, might have been at one of Dolly's things. Janet was standing near the tea table, watching Marion across the room. Marion was with Roger, the boy must have been 15 or so, and Arthur. The 3 of them. Family portrait sort of thing." He paused. He folded the newspaper. Janet said, and I remember because it was an ODD thing to say, she said, "Marion has had a very fortunate life. Some of us have not." "And how did she say it?" "Quietly. Not bitter exactly. More like stating a fact, the way you'd say, 'It's raining.' Not angry about the rain. Just wet." "Thank you, Colonel." "Is it important?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it may be the most important thing anyone has said to me this week." She walked back through the village. The light was fading. Lamps were coming on in cottage windows, warm squares of yellow in the gray dusk, and the air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of an English evening in early spring. Miss Marple was not thinking about the evening. She was thinking about 30 years. 30 years of living next door to Marion Partridge, 30 years of watching through the garden fence, watching Marion with Arthur, watching Marion with Roger, watching Marion tend her roses and chair the flower committee and walk to church every Sunday in the same good coat. 30 years of being invited to tea and invited to Christmas and invited to every occasion where a single woman is included out of kindness and excluded from the thing that matters, the having of a husband, a son, a family, a position. Janet Callender had none of these things. She had a cottage with a blue gate. She had a garden. She had committees and charitable works and the word kind attached to her name like a consolation prize. She had 30 years of standing at the edge of Marion Partridge's life, close enough to see everything and far enough to touch nothing. Envy is a strange emotion. It does not always announce itself. It does not always look like envy. Sometimes it looks like devotion. Sometimes it looks like friendship. Sometimes it looks like a woman who brings tea every afternoon and adjusts the cushion and measures the dose and says, "Poor Marion," with such tenderness that no one thinks to look at what is underneath. Janet had not planned this. Miss Marple was certain of that. Janet was not Diana. She did not make plans, did not think in strategies, did not calculate outcomes with the cold precision of a woman who had studied law. Janet's crime was not premeditated in the way that Inspector Slack would understand the word, but it was premeditated in a deeper sense. It had been growing for 30 years, growing slowly, invisibly, the way foxglove grows in the corner of a garden, unnoticed until it flowers. When the rumor broke, Janet had seen her friend humiliated, broken, abandoned, and she had felt, Miss Marple was sure of this, genuine sympathy. She had gone to Marion. She had brought tea. She had sat with her. But she had also felt something else, something she would never have named, never have admitted, perhaps never have recognized in herself. She had felt that it was fair, that for once Marion Partridge, fortunate Marion, with her husband and her son in her position, was learning what it felt like to have nothing, to sit alone in a chair with the curtains drawn and nobody calling, to know that the village had moved on without her. Janet knew that feeling. She had known it for 30 years. And somewhere in the last week of Marion's life, between the first cup of herbal tea and the last, the sympathy had curdled, not into hatred. Janet did not hate Marion. She loved her. That was the terrible part. She loved her and she envied her, and the two emotions had grown so tightly together that she could no longer tell which root fed which flower. She had counted the pills. She had brewed the tea, stronger, this time, with something extra from the garden. She had placed the cushion. She had closed the door softly behind her. And she had gone home to her cottage with the blue gate and the beautiful garden where the foxglove grew beside the chamomile, and she had slept soundly for the first time in months. Miss Marple called on Janet Callender the following morning. She did not call alone. Inspector Slack stood in Janet's sitting room with the expression of a man who had been told something he did not want to believe and was halfway through the process of believing it anyway. He had been resistant. "With respect, Miss Marple, this is a closed case." But Miss Marple had mentioned the cushion, the tea, the dosage, and the foxglove. And Inspector Slack, who was not clever but was not stupid either, had done the arithmetic. Janet was in her chair. She had made tea, Darjeeling, and set out 3 cups as though this were a social call. She was wearing a gray cardigan and a string of small pearls that had belonged to her mother. Her hands were steady. "Miss Callender," said Inspector Slack, and then stopped, because he did not know how to continue. Accusations were easy when the suspect looked guilty. Janet Callender looked like a woman expecting guests. Miss Marple sat down. She did not take the tea. "Janet," she said, "tell me about Tuesday." "Which Tuesday?" "The last Tuesday of Marion's life, the evening you brought the tea." Janet's hands moved to her lap. She folded them, left over right, the way she always folded them. "I brought the tea, as usual." "Chamomile and lavender?" "I poured 2 cups. She drank 1. I left the second on the table." "And the pills?" "I measured her dose, 1 tablet, in a glass of water." "1," said Miss Marple. "1." "Janet, the bottle was empty." Silence. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, a wood pigeon called, that low, repetitive 2-note sound that is either soothing or maddening, depending on the state of one's conscience. "She must have taken the rest herself," said Janet, "after I left." "The bottle was on your shelf," said Miss Marple. "Not hers. You brought it here." "I was keeping them safe." "You were keeping the evidence." Janet looked at Miss Marple. Not with anger, with something older, deeper, more exhausted than anger. She looked at her the way a person looks at a mirror they have been avoiding. "You don't understand," she said. "I think I do." She was suffering. Every day, every hour, she sat in that chair and suffered. The village had destroyed her. Her own son had abandoned her. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and so you helped her. Janet's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I helped her," she said. "Yes, I helped her sleep. With foxglove in the tea." The clock ticked. The pigeon called. "Not much," said Janet. "Not enough to— I didn't—" She stopped. She pressed her palms together, fingers interlocking. She was in pain. She was my friend. I couldn't watch her. "You could have watched her," said Miss Marple. "You could have sat with her and watched her suffer and done nothing. That is what friends do. They endure. They do not decide." Janet's face crumpled. It did not crumple into tears. It crumpled into something worse, a kind of structural collapse, as though the thing holding her features together had been quietly removed. "I was her friend," she whispered. "You were," said Miss Marple. "That's what made it possible." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. He reached for his notebook. He opened it to a fresh page. The page was very white and very blank, and he stared at it for several seconds before writing anything. "Mrs. Callender," he said, "I think you'd better come with me." Janet stood. She straightened her cardigan. She touched the pearls at her throat, a small, automatic gesture, the kind of thing a woman does when she's about to leave the house and wants to make sure she's presentable. "May I water the garden first?" she said. Inspector Slack looked at Miss Marple. Miss Marple looked at the window, where the garden was visible, the roses, the lavender, the foxglove in the corner, all of it gold and green in the morning light. "No," said Inspector Slack. "I don't think so." They left. The door closed. The sitting room was empty, 3 cups of tea, untouched, cooling on the table. Miss Marple sat for a moment. She did not drink the tea. She looked at the shelf where the bottle had been. It was gone now, taken by Slack, and at the chair where Janet had sat, and at the garden through the window, where the foxglove swayed slightly in a breeze that had no opinion about anything. Then she put on her hat and walked home. Janet Callender was arrested on Thursday morning. The toxicology report, when it came, found traces of digitalis glycoside in the tea residue from Mrs. Partridge's cup. The barbitone had been a secondary cause, the foxglove had weakened her heart, and the sleeping pills had done the rest. Janet had not, in the strictest sense, given her a lethal dose of either. She had given her a lethal combination. Inspector Slack called it murder. The coroner, eventually, agreed. Diana Partridge was not charged. Starting a rumor, however deliberately, is not a criminal offense, a fact that Miss Marple found neither surprising nor satisfactory. But the question remained, who killed Mrs. Partridge? Diana, who dropped a sentence in a shop, knowing what the village would do with it. She had wanted leverage, not death. But she had lit the match. Mrs. Price Ridley, who amplified the rumor with the efficiency of a woman who mistook information for duty. She had not created the fire, but she had fed it oxygen. Miss Hartnell, who changed the story, added a farmer, subtracted the truth, because embellishment was, to her, a form of accuracy. She had not meant harm, but harm does not require intention. Mrs. Turner, who passed it on because it was remarkable and the bread delivery was late, and the Henderson boy was underfoot, and the sentence was out of her mouth before she considered where it would land. Tommy Landon, who told Roger in the pub because he thought a man ought to know, and because silence felt like complicity, and because a pint of mild and bitter makes difficult things feel simple. Roger, who heard the rumor and did not go to his mother, who sat in his kitchen for 3 nights and chose silence over love. Or Janet, who brought the tea. Miss Marple stood in her garden. The daffodils were out, the ones Marion Partridge had helped her plant 2 autumns ago, kneeling side by side in the cold earth, pressing bulbs into the ground, with the shared understanding that spring would come and the flowers would open, and neither of them needed to say anything about that. Because some things between women who have known each other for 30 years do not require words. Everyone had a hand in it, she said to the daffodils or to no one, but only one of them intended it. She paused. The evening air was still. A blackbird sang from the top of the hedge, that liquid, cascading song that is the sound of an English garden at dusk. "Though I wonder," she said more quietly, "whether intention is the measure, or whether it is consequence." She did not answer. Some questions, she felt, were not hers to answer. And so it ends, dear friends, though ends is perhaps too tidy a word for tonight. A sentence was spoken over a garden fence. It passed through 6 mouths, changed shape 5 times, and killed a woman who had done nothing worse than love her sister's child. One person started it. One person finished it. And everyone in between carried it forward, each convinced they were merely passing on what they had heard, as though the passing were innocent, as though words, once released, were no longer the responsibility of the mouth that shaped them. Mrs. Partridge is buried in the churchyard of St. Mary Mead, beside Arthur. The gravestone says what gravestones say. It does not mention the sentence. It does not mention the tea. Janet Callender's cottage stands empty. The blue gate is closed. The garden is already beginning to forget its gardener, weeds in the lavender, dead heads on the roses, and the foxglove, which needs no tending, growing taller than ever in the corner by the wall. Mrs. Price Ridley has moved on to other subjects. Miss Hartnell has taken up a new committee. Mrs. Turner is slicing bread. The village continues. It always does. I leave you tonight with Miss Marple's question, detective, because I cannot answer it myself. Who killed Mrs. Partridge? The one who spoke? The one who listened? The one who passed it on? Or the one who poured the tea? Perhaps the answer is all of them. Perhaps the answer is none. Perhaps the answer is that a village, like any family, is capable of destroying the thing it loves, not through malice, but through the simple, careless, unstoppable momentum of words. Rest well tonight. Keep your words close. Next week brings new faces to St. Mary Mead, a bride, a doctor's wife, and someone who should have stayed in London. I'll see you tomorrow evening, detective, and I suggest you bring a strong cup of tea. Good night.